And we have with us the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He is our guest this morning on Morning Joe. Good to have you.
Good morning.
So as we move forward, we're looking at the president holding a rally in Michigan at the very time the vote is set to potentially impeach him, the third president in American history to be impeached. Is there a strategy to focus this and make it timely, in part because of the president's very dramatic reaction to the facts being put out before him?
I would say the timing is driven more by the fact that the plot continues, we've had a lot of discussion. Should we wait, try to bring in more witnesses? It's taken us 8 months to go from subpoena to a first court decision in Don McGahn. And given that the president has made clear he's not going to stop seeking foreign intervention in our election, he's out on the White House lawn saying that if we're being honest, there's a simple answer. I want Ukraine to do this investigation.
Right.
His lawyer, even this week, was in Ukraine seeking to dig up the same kind of dirt. So the timing is really driven by the urgency, and that is
a national security issue. Yes,
a national security issue, an issue of our election integrity. If the president is seeking still to essentially cheat in the next election, that is not a remedy for his misconduct. The remedy is impeachment. And that's why we've moved forward, and we've done so, methodically, but nonetheless with a sense of urgency.
Chairman, I want to give you a chance to respond to what the president said about you in his letter to Nancy Pelosi yesterday. But first, I want to ask you about one of the criticisms we've heard from Republicans, heard again from Ranking Member Collins in that Rules Committee hearing yesterday, which is that this process had a set calendar, that you've rushed to the end of it, that you wanted to get out of town by the end of this week, get the vote in, and that Republicans believe there ought to be a more fulsome process with more witnesses and more evidence presented and time to get documents to come in. What do you say to the criticism that this process has gone too quickly?
Well, Mr. Collins would have more credibility if he were joining us and saying to the administration, provide Congress the documents, respond to the subpoenas. They're lawful. You need to answer. He'd have more credibility if he said, let's bring in Bolton, let's bring in Mulvaney, let's bring in Pompeo, let's bring in others that have firsthand relevant information. But, of course, he's not saying that. And neither is Mitch McConnell. They don't want to hear these witnesses. They do want to complain about process, but at the same time, they don't really want to see the evidence. And the fact is, the evidence is really already uncontested and overwhelming. If we have yet additional witnesses who further corroborate what we already know, yes, it makes the case that much stronger. But the case is already overwhelming. And so I think those process objections fall flat when they're not really interested in having those witnesses come in or receiving those documents.
So the president did write that rambling 6-page letter to Speaker Pelosi yesterday. In it, he writes, quote, Congressman Adam Schiff cheated and lied all the way up to the present day, even going so far as to fraudulently make up out of thin air my conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine and read this fantasy language to Congress as though it were said by me. The president continued, his shameless lies and deceptions dating all the way back to the Russia hoax is one of the main reasons we are here today. How do you respond?
That's probably the nicest thing he's had to say about me in quite some time. This president does nothing but project onto others his own lack of morality. This is someone who mocks others constantly but can't stand to be mocked himself. Look, the call record speaks for itself, and it's damning. He doesn't want to defend it. He can't defend it. He doesn't want to explain why he held up $400 million in military aid to coerce an ally at war with Russia into doing his election dirty work. He'd rather attack me. When Bob Mueller was the investigator, he attacked Bob Mueller. When Colonel Vindman is testifying, he attacks Colonel Vindman. When Marie Yovanovitch is testifying, he attacks her. Anyone willing to stand up to him, he's going to go after. I just view it as a part of my job, and I'm going to keep my focus on holding this president accountable.
We're going to turn the corner and get to what's happening today in a minute. I just wanted to follow up. This weekend you went on Chris Wallace. Chris questioned you about the IG report, whether you should have known more in September about the FISA warrants and why they were improper, and why, for instance, Devin Nunes wrote a memo that was more in line with what the IG's findings ultimately were than what you were saying back then.
Well, the reality is 2 years ago, we didn't know what we know today. 2 years ago, when Mr. Nunes was saying this investigation was improperly begun, they were spying on the Trump campaign, this was all driven by political bias. Of course, all that was wrong. He also speculated that there were problems with the FISA applications. That ended up being correct, but not for the reasons that he said. It ended up being correct because we would learn 2 years later that an FBI low-level lawyer falsified information that went into the FISA, that they withheld information.
Did Devin Nunes know that 2 years ago?
No.
Because the crown has been placed on Devin Nunes' head, again, as the arbiter of truth, which is pretty funny when you look at what he did, holding a press conference in the House saying he had information, then getting the information from the White House, then holding a press conference there. I mean, again, it sort of shows a sorry state of Trumpism that this guy's their hero. But Devin Nunes, so you're saying Devin Nunes did not say in the memo 2 years ago what the IG said?
That's right.
As far as the facts?
The vast majority of what the IG revealed...
Other than conclusions.
The vast majority of what the IG revealed about flaws in the FISA application were not known to either me or Mr. Nunes 2 years ago. They were the product of 170 interviews and 2 million documents we didn't have. We were really in the same position as the FISA court, and that is we did not know about all the flaws and problems in the FBI's production of the FISA applications.
Can we talk really briefly about just an absolute stinging rebuke toward the FBI yesterday and a decision that was made on how they need to overhaul the process? Talk about that, and also talk about how this process, in the end, at least I think, should make all Americans feel a little more comfortable about the FISA court, and how there have been abuses, and how yesterday it seems that some of those abuses are going to be reformed now.
Well, I think the FISA court was exactly right in the stern opinion it issued yesterday. And what the FISA court basically said is this is an ex-parte process. That is, the suspect is not represented before the FISA court. Only the government is there. And therefore, the court is completely reliant on the government telling the truth, the government being forthcoming, the government saying, this is the strength of what we have to offer, but these are also the weaknesses. We want you to know it all. And when the government doesn't do that, and they didn't do that here, then the court feels that it was not only taken advantage of, but that the law was subverted in a way that causes the court to question when other applications are made. So I think the court is right to come down hard on the Bureau. At the same time, this is a vital process. We need to be able to have a method of going to court with classified information when we suspect someone is an agent of a foreign power. So that process has to continue, but clearly the safeguards I think that the Inspector General recommended need to be implemented, and perhaps others as well.
So, Congressman, the Washington Post reports that Vice President Mike Pence has refused to declassify testimony about what he said in a September phone call with the president of Ukraine in what you call directly relevant to the impeachment debate. According to the Post, in a letter to Pence yesterday, Congressman, you wrote that classified witness testimony gathered during the impeachment inquiry raises profound questions about your knowledge of the president's scheme to solicit Ukraine's interference in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Is this concerning the testimony from Pence's Russia advisor, Jennifer Williams, that was provided as a supplemental written submission to the Intel Committee last month? What can you tell us, and is the vice president covering something up?
Well, what I can tell you is this. When Jennifer Williams testified in her deposition, she represented what she knew at the time. When she came back to the open hearing, she informed us during the open hearing that she had additional information to share of a classified nature that would shed more light on her recollection of events. And this pertained to that phone call between Vice President Pence and President Zelensky. Now, you'll remember Ambassador Sondland said that he told the Vice President about the withholding of this aid, the conditionality of this aid, and the President's desire to have these investigations. And the Vice President said nothing, basically absorbed the knowledge, didn't contest it, didn't say, what are you talking about, didn't raise alarm, but merely stood and listened to what he was conveying. The Vice President has denied that conversation, essentially said it didn't take place, I don't know what you're talking about. This submission sheds light on who's telling the truth. And I think the American people should see it. I think there's no reason it should be classified. It's not appropriate to classify information because it might be embarrassing or incriminating. And so we're going to push to get that declassified. And it's telling that the vice president thus far has been resistant.